This story is entitled The Year I Murdered My Grandma, based on my memories of when I was 10 years old in 1963. I loved my grandmother dearly. She was a tough cookie, and my young friends knew this from the icy stares that she would wield when she got annoyed. She had no patience for us little urchins who were always hollering and scurrying about. I don't think she ever smiled, and she never really hugged me, but I still loved her. Sometimes she made the most delicious old-fashioned raisin oatmeal cookies for me and my friends. You might think that kids wouldn't like raisin oatmeal, but they were prepared from some age-old recipe and were baked in Grandma's cast iron wood stove. A friend had tried one time to grab a second cookie, but when her cold stare caught him, he quickly pulled his hand back. I wish I could say that they tasted so much better because of the love that she put into making them. But I'm pretty sure there was some secret ingredient other than love that accomplished that. I lived with my parents and two sisters on the second floor of her home with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a bath. My room was in the hallway right outside my parents' bedroom. Not much privacy, but no one seemed to bemoan our living situation. Grandma Pauls had lived through tough times during the Depression, and now in her 80s she was being cared for by my dad, her son Frederick. Her half of the house definitely smelled different, and her furniture seemed like it must have been 100 years old. She still used her wood stove that sometimes seemed to be fired up way too hot. I'm sure the thought of this frail 85-year-old woman building a fire every morning put the fear of God into both of my parents. There were no smoke alarms back then, and other than hopefully someone yelling, "Fire!" there weren't a lot of precautions taken. With a coal furnace fiercely burning in the basement and a red-hot cast iron stove on the first floor, it's a miracle that we never had a house fire. None of us kids had concerns for our safety because we trusted the adults around us. We knew that we'd be protected by them if anything were to go wrong. I would experience just such an incident, and fortunately it was my grandma who, although hard of hearing, would hear my screeches for help and come to my rescue. I had gotten my foot wedged in between our swing set and nearby tree, and it seemed like no one was around to hear me hollering. It was quite painful, and I was panicking. If I wasn't able to free myself, then I'd be discovered unconscious, hanging there by my foot. My grandmother came shuffling around the corner of the garage and was grumbling to herself about all the commotion I was causing. She marched over to the swing, pushed the support pole, and freed my foot, and as I slid to the ground, she mumbled something else. She turned around, stumbled a little, and then dragged herself back into the house. I lay there looking up at the vice that early had mercilessly imprisoned me until my liberator had arrived. From that moment on, I decided that I was going to show my grandma how much I loved her every day. That evening, she fell ill and was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. She resisted being taken to the hospital because in her mind, that's where people went to die. It was hard to see her carted off that way, and I vowed to keep praying for her until she came home. My mom forewarned me that Grandma Pauls had been very ill and that sometimes when people are as old as she is, they have a hard time recovering. Her warnings didn't faze me because I had committed myself to praying for her and using all my influence with God to get her better. Besides, I hadn't been going to church every Sunday for nothing, and I figured this was a good time as ever to call on God's authority to get my grandma home. That week, I couldn't wait for Sunday to get here. I might be praying every night for her, but I knew prayers in the church had more power. When it came time during Sunday service for everyone to pray for others, I was ready with my hands together and pointed directly to heaven in hopes of getting the best signal sent up there. I knew that there were dozens of prayers being sent at the same time, and I wanted my prayer to get there first. When I got home from church, there was an ambulance in the driveway and 2 men, all in white, came out of the house. I jumped out of the just barely stopped car and ran into the house and saw my grandma sitting upright on the couch. I would have run over and hugged her, but I knew that she didn't care for that, so I just said, "Hi Grandma, how you doing?" She just grumbled something and went back to petting the cat on her lap.
Okay.
Her indifference to me didn't make me sad because as far as I was concerned, God and I had just pulled off something that was pretty cool. There was no high-fiving in 1963, so I just smiled and nodded to the sky. For the next few weeks she recovered, and within a month she was back to hobbling around. A bit slower for the wear, but she was getting back to her old self with icy glares and all. I was glad to be able to help her whenever I could. After all, I still remember the foot trap incident, and I hadn't forgotten my vow to show my love for her every day. One day my friends and I were picking and eating a lot of semi-ripe black cherries from our backyard tree. They didn't quite taste right, but we were anxious to get started with the cherry season. My grandma started banging on her back window and motioning for us to get out of the yard. I still loved her, but I didn't like her telling us to get out. My one friend was looking pretty sick, and right about then we heard the bang of the back door screen. Like one of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders attacking San Juan Hill, my grandma came towards us and was threatening our lives if we didn't stop eating those unripe cherries. We took off running except for my sick friend who just bent over and let loose. He was able to stagger away afterwards and we met up with him across the street. I was mad at my grandma and I apologized to my scared friends who said they weren't ever going back into my yard to play again. 2 days later, Grandma went back into the hospital, but I was still mad at her. I wasn't going to pray for her this time because she was so mean to us. When it came time in church to say our prayers for others, I refused to put in a good word for her. Being in the church with all its beautiful sunlit stained glass, I began to weaken in my stance about not praying for her. I caught myself before doing so and said to myself, nope, I'm not going to do it. She was mean to me and my friends, so I'm not using my limited request for God's help again. That Sunday night, I didn't include Grandma in my prayers. My mother was at the front door when I came home from school the next day. She looked pretty serious, and she asked me to have a seat in Grandma's living room. Sitting across from me, she told me that Grandma Paltz had died. There was a loud knock at the door, so Mom touched my shoulder and got up to go to the door. I sat there staring at the discolored floral pattern on the stained wallpaper in front of me. My head slowly lowered to the base of the wall where a ripped corner of the paper had started to peel, and the grubby plasterboard underneath was exposed. Everything looked pretty grim now that I realized I had murdered my grandma.